So from Hippolytus, we go to 1 John. And this morning is my second in my three-part little mini-series on 1 John. So just to briefly recap for those who missed last week, 1 John is not a letter written by John. You might assume that from the name, but rather an anonymous homily, a short sermon. Someone asked me this week, what's a homily? Well, it's just basically a short sermon. And it comes out of what scholars call the Johannine community, a community formed around a very honored, respected teacher. 2nd and 3rd John identify him as an elder of the church. And this community produced then what we know today as the Johannine literature, 1 John, and then the two letters that follow, very cleverly named 2nd and 3rd John, right? And they are genuine letters. If you look at them, you can see they have the format of a letter. And then also the Gospel of John. And that teacher, even though is anonymous to us, became associated with the person we know as John, the disciple of Jesus, by the late 2nd century. And that is entirely plausible. It was common in that time to gather around a respected teacher like that. But we can't know for sure since the literature itself does not identify the author. Nowhere does it claim to have been written by him. So regardless, this text is an authentic witness to the thoughts and beliefs of the early Christian community and was quickly recognized as part of that sacred tradition of the witness to the gospel. And at the center of the text is the famous affirmation that we examined last week, God is love. And this is one of the reasons we associate 1 John with the Gospel of John, because if you listen to the text who was our worship leader? Boy, my memory. Huh? Judith was it. The Judith read for us. You'll recognize the themes in 1 John. So from that most basic affirmation, John makes the case that followers of Jesus must therefore love one another to be authentic in their faith. And chapter 4 that we looked at last week concludes, the commandment we have from him is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also, which we heard then in the reading from the Gospel of John. So continuing and building on that, we read now in chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God, and everyone who loves the parent loves the child. By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and obey his commandments. For the love of God is this, that we obey his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome, for whatever is born of God conquers the world. And this is the victory that conquers the world, our faith. Who is it that conquers the world but the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? So April, when she was doing the Children Moments a couple of weeks ago, told the story of the Wesley brothers. And John Wesley, one of them, proclaimed that 1 John speaks to the whole church in all succeeding ages. I'm lucky if I speak to 2 or 3 church members, in the following week, right? So what does this 1900-year-old sermon have to say that is still relevant to us today? The command to love, of course, never loses relevance. However, with the rise that we are seeing today in hate groups and blatant displays of racism, bigotry, and fear-mongering, the command to love, I think, is never more needed than it is today. Now, we're all familiar, I hope, with John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. But do you know 1 John 3:16? It's a great companion to John 3:16. 1 John 3:16 says, for we know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. And that's all well and good, at least in theory, until we're actually tested. Because other than first responders and many of those in the military, most of us are never put in that position where we are asked to risk our lives for the sake of another. But John goes on from there to describe the work of love in very concrete terms that does have real implications for all of us just about every day of our lives. 1 John 3:17, we read, how does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? Which I think pretty much sums up our responsibility as followers of Jesus. So 2 stories to illustrate that responsibility, one in the negative, one in the positive. We'll begin with the negative. So anyone recognize this picture? How quickly we forget. Right? Tom DeLay, the former majority leader of the House in the 1990s, who was indicted for election fraud in his home state of Texas, and this is the picture they took when they booked him, right? He said of the picture, "I said a little prayer before I actually did the fingerprint thing in the picture, and my prayer was, let people see Christ through me and let me smile." There you go. How nice, right? My favorite quote of then Majority Leader DeLay was a comment he made in response to a failed bill on youth access to guns. He said, "Guns have little or nothing to do with juvenile violence. The causes of youth violence are working parents who put their kids into daycare, the teaching of evolution in the schools, and working mothers who take birth control pills." So there you go. Seriously. But I'm sure he said it with a smile. Now, DeLay, you may recall, was initially convicted and sentenced to 3 years of prison, but the conviction was overturned on appeal by the Supreme Court, the Texas Supreme Court, so I'm sure he felt vindicated. I cited his example not because of anything he was alleged to have done in that particular case, but what the record shows he most certainly did do as the majority leader before his legal problems began. After World War II, a group of islands north of Guam, known as the Mariana Islands, came under U.S. protection in 1975 and officially became part of the U.S. Commonwealth. And we just happened to have the kids of Phyllis Weir with us, who come from Guam, and I was just chatting with them. That's why I was late, because I said, "You know this story," and they do. So I'm eager to talk to them. You may want to talk to them about this. So to promote economic development, the Northern Mariana Islands became an experiment in free market capitalism that was exempt from U.S. labor and immigration laws. And garment companies were quick to erect factories to produce clothing with the Made in USA label. The irony is over 90% of the workers making those clothes were all immigrants brought to the Mariana Islands from impoverished Asian countries, people desperate for work. But they were on U.S. soil, so made in the USA. And by the 90s, the garment industry in the Marianas had grown to $1 billion industry, but it had an image problem. Articles appearing in the United States about sweatshop conditions in the factories, workers earning less than $3 an hour, working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, labor camps behind barbed wire, women forced to have abortions so that they could continue working, and anyone who complained about the working conditions immediately was deported, so on and so forth. In essence, it was modern-day slavery made in the USA. And to counter their growing image problem, the government then of the Northern Mariana Islands hired a lobby firm which proceeded to fly in politicians, right, on junkets of golf and high dining at beachfront resorts, and their efforts paid off big time. When a Senate committee launched an investigation to the conditions, they sent 2 senators, a Democrat from Hawaii, a Republican from Alaska. They were given the usual industry-sponsored tour. But the good senators were suspicious, and feigning jet lag, they dropped out of the tour only to meet up with investigators who gave them the unvarnished truth. And when they returned, they issued a scathing report. Senator Frank Murkowski, the Republican from Alaska, was so enraged by what he saw, he sponsored legislation to apply U.S. labor law to the Commonwealth, which was unanimously approved by the Senate. The bill, however, never saw the light of day in the House. Why? Our smiling friend Tom DeLay had been one of the first congressmen recruited by those lobbyists, and he essentially was bought out, prevented the bill from ever being brought out of committee. Now, you might recognize the name of that lobbyist, Jack Abramoff, who along with 21 others was later convicted for conspiracy to bribe public officials and tax evasion. So the good news in that story is that those abusive labor practices finally came to an end after Abramoff's firm was no longer able to protect it, and DeLay had to resign from Congress because of his legal problems. And the Senate and both houses passed legislation in 2008 to put that Commonwealth under U.S. standard labor law. However, one of the reasons I bring this up is because two of those involved in the cover-up continue to serve in our government today. One, Patrick Pizzilla, part of Abramoff's team to schmooze those lawmakers, was appointed by President Trump to be the Deputy Secretary of Labor, and confirmed by the Senate on a straight party line vote. The other was a pollster who was included in one of those first-class junkets arranged by Pizzilla, and you may have heard of her. Then she was Kellyanne Fitzpatrick. You know her under her maiden name, Kellyanne Conway, advisor to the president. So again, I give you 1 John 3:17. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? In contrast to a politician so corrupt he cannot see how he has betrayed the very Christ for whom he smiles, I give you this example of everyday preachers in the heart of Charlottesville, where the Unite the Right rally occurred 1 year ago today, resulting in that death of the counter-protester and the two police officers, as the town endures yet another round this very moment. You'll read about it in the news this evening and tomorrow if you haven't already. Brittany Kane Conley and Seth Westbowee, pictured here in the middle in their white robes, are ministers of the United Church of Christ in Charlottesville. The Reverend Westbowee grew up in Charlottesville. He returned there with his wife to raise their daughter. And shortly after moving back, he was walking with his daughter one day in the city town square, and the daughter asked about a prominent statue of General Robert E. Lee. And the rest of the story is told in the publication of the World Council of Churches. I explained that statue was a general from the Civil War, the war related to the freeing of slaves. Using perfect kid knowledge, my daughter said, of course, he fought for freeing the slaves. I had to say, no, he fought to maintain slavery. His daughter asked, so why is there a statue of him? Precisely, right? And he didn't have an answer. But from that encounter and from others, he came to realize that a good part of combating racism is having the guts, both spiritual and physical, to show up, to say something, to refuse silence, to come up with an answer. And Westbowee joined forces with his friend and colleague, Brittany Kane Conley. And Brittany's short bio says she lives in Charlottesville with her wife, Lindsay, and their skeptical dog, Eliza. She enjoys dancing, deconstructing destructive dominoes of dominance and alliterations. I love that, right? A minister with a strong sense of humor to go with her social justice. And together, the two ministers organized Congregate Charlottesville, a group of faith leaders who are willing to show up and to stand against the white supremacists coming to town. They began following the example of Martin Luther King, organizing meetings to train people in nonviolence and, if necessary, civil disobedience. Kane Conley writes in a United Church of Christ blog, as we've begun to organize, we've often heard, just let them be, don't show up, they want attention, let them have their rally. So let me be clear, white supremacy is a structure of evil. This overt display of white supremacy in our town does violence to black and brown and marginalized bodies. We will not remain silent. We will not be absent when white supremacy presents itself boldly and unabashedly. God calls for our presence. I believe God calls us to use our bodies for justice. I'm fully convinced Jesus would use his body to protect the most violated and most marginalized, to confront violence and oppression, because that's what he did. In story after story in the Gospels, Jesus shows up and puts his body next to or in front of people who are despised, beaten down, and violated. Remember that story, the woman caught in adultery, right? And in the ultimate form of nonviolent resistance, Jesus used his body as reparative action. The state and religious powers hung his body from a tree. And because Jesus was lynched by the powers, he ignited a movement that proclaimed, we must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Love will win. Jesus was a healer, but yes, Jesus was also divisive. That's why they killed him. I stand by the liberating theological claim that God has a preference for the poor, that Jesus stood with the marginalized at the displeasure of the rich and powerful. Jesus refused to be complicit with the systems of injustice that we still grapple with today. He used his body to dismantle their power. I hope to use my body to confront and counteract white supremacy. I hope others will join me. I pray that white folk will show up to dismantle white supremacy, because it is certainly our job to do so. Will you join her? Strong words from a young preacher, and especially relevant today on this anniversary of that Charlottesville rally that shocked the nation 1 year ago. Now, please note, the author of 1 John uses a rather startling phrase that conjures up images of world power, supremacy, and domination, such as many claim today for their beliefs. So listen again to the last bit of the text from 1 John 5. For whatever is born of God conquers the world. And this is the victory that conquers the world, our faith. Who is it that conquers the world but the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? Now, before you take this as an endorsement of either an American or Christian empire, consider first who was known as the conqueror of the world in the first century. Augustus Caesar, right? And when you go to that world, as we did in that tour, many of us did in 2011, you see him everywhere you go. Oh, that's Frank. He looks a lot like Augustus. And dominating the ancient city of Bryant, where Frank is there resting in western Turkey, was a temple built for the goddess Athena. And larger than this church, a magnificent structure built in marble, now in ruins. You can walk up and touch that enormous marble beam, as our group did back in 2011, that once hung over the entrance to the temple, and which proclaims for all to see, the people dedicate this temple to Athena and to the world conqueror Caesar, the Son of God, the God Augustus. You've heard me use this many times, so it shouldn't surprise most of you. But I was curious about that word conqueror. And I wondered if 1 John uses that same word etched into the beam for Caesar, imperator, from which we get the word emperor. But much to my surprise, the Greek word here in 1 John is even more familiar to us than that word. Any guesses? It is Nike, from which we get Nike, not the shoe company, but the goddess of victory. This is the Nike that Nikes or conquers the world. It's a verb also in Greek. The text literally says, for whatever is born of God Nikes the world. Right? That is the Nike that conquers the world, our faith. In other words, instead of a justification to dominate the world for Jesus, this is a rejection of world domination by the gods of empire. Victory belongs not to Nike, not to the world conqueror Caesar, not to empire then or now, but to those who place their faith in Christ as the Son of God. That is the essence of what we claim. The author of 1 John saw the world primarily as a place dominated by evil. That was his context. In that late first century, Christians were heavily persecuted by the Roman Empire, and so it makes sense. In their experience, the world was largely an evil place. Our experience of the world may be similar, right, or vastly different, depending on where we stand in society. Do we benefit from the status quo, or are we victims of the status quo? The concept of conquering the world here through faith in Christ simply means we will rise above the corrupt ways of this world, that we will not let the forces, outside forces, control our lives, that we will succumb to no one other than Christ. How do we differ from terrorists and those who make similar claims for their faith? For that matter, how do we differ from politicians who smile for Jesus while they protect the exploitation of the poor and the weak by their campaign donors? If we are to have any hope of being any different, it can only be in the character of the God who John says is love. To be a child of God means that love dictates our lives, and therefore it is love that conquers the world. To conquer or overcome the way of the world by any other means is to succumb to its Nike, its victory, rather than God's will. Hence, to be born of God is not some privilege that gives us the right to build empires. It is a responsibility that should cause people to see Christ through us and the ways in which we lay down our lives out of love for others. And the message of 1 John is Nike. Just do it. And oh yes, don't forget to smile. For any smiling in the love of God given to us that we share with the world, who seek to make it tangible with our bodies, to share in concrete ways that love of God for every person, and especially those victimized by our society, those subject to violence and cruelty and hate, to stand up, to stand for the love of God, the faith of Christ, the respect of all people God gives to all as children of God. For any who wish to be part of a congregation that seeks to do that, to make it visible on our side of our building to the way we give witness in the street, we invite to join with us, to make their confession of faith public this morning, to transfer membership, to rededicate their life to Christ, to join with us as we seek to make this love real.